So thus far in our modules, we've been really focusing on the individual performance of our staff or change agents and supporting that performance, feedback, training, etc. And it's really important to remember that just like our clients who don't operate in a vacuum, neither do our change agents. And so typically it's necessary to really look at the larger systemic organization and how that environment is contributing to your staff's performance. Oftentimes, it requires addressing the structures and policies and systems at the organizational level in order to actually create that change we're looking for and support and maintain that in an ongoing way. So as we've been discussing this term thus far, it's really important that we conceptualize our staff's performance deficits in a behavior analytic way, just like we conceptualize our clients' behaviors. Going back to Skinner's quote that the learner is always right, we really have to avoid this cop-out attitude that they talk about in the text and avoid placing blame on our staff when we see any types of performance deficits. To quote the text, supervisors must view the quality of staff performance as a direct reflection of the effectiveness of their supervision and training. So when you don't see your staff that you're responsible for training and supervising, performing up to your expectations, you need to be looking at your training and supervisory practices and how those are potentially impeding or not supporting that proficient performance you're looking for. Just like with our clients, if a client isn't doing what they're supposed to be doing, we don't blame them. We don't say that they don't care or they're lazy or that they don't have a work ethic. We look at the environmental variables that are prohibiting or impeding their performance. And we have to do the same with our staff. And remember, our ethical code 4.04 says that when behavior analysts are functioning as supervisors, we are accountable not just for our supervisory practices, but for all the professional activities that our supervisees engage in when that supervisory relationship is in place. So that means that it is on us. It is our job to actually go through and do those performance analyses and look at the environment and advocate for ways to set it up in such a way that it would be conducive to supporting proficient performance. It's not just enough for us to say, well, I did my job, I trained them, or I did my job, I went and supervised them for an hour or whatever each week, if that's the way you're training. If the way that we're supervising is not producing the performance that we expect or need, then we have to go back to the drawing board and see how we can do things differently. So in the text, they really emphasize the importance of not relying on error correction and punitive measures to support proficient performance. And I can't emphasize this enough. Remember, we need to approach the behavior of our supervisees in a conceptually systematic way, just as we would the behavior of our clients. We wouldn't ever use punishment to try and teach a skill or increase demonstrations of that skill. And we know that the only way to actually increase and maintain behavior successfully is through reinforcement. Yet, we default to using the threat of punishment or other aversive outcomes with our staff and expect them to maintain proficient performance. At best, then our staff's behaviors are maintained by negative reinforcement. And we know that behavior maintained by negative reinforcement often results in counter control behaviors being evoked and the maintenance of narrow, rigid repertoires. So just think about the social validity of that experience. I don't think any of us could say that we prefer working in situations where the only reason we're doing what we're doing is to avoid getting in trouble. This quote in the book is really interesting. It says that good supervision is often equated with persistent punishment of staff, inappropriate or non-proficient performance, meaning that the definition of a good supervisor is often one who catches everyone doing everything wrong and punishes them for it. It's important to consider who exactly is calling this method quote unquote good supervision, or these people quote unquote good supervisors. I can't imagine that this evaluation is coming from actual supervisees. So I'm assuming that it's coming from higher ups above the supervisors. This would make sense if I'm the supervisor of a supervisor. So maybe the CEO or something like that. And I see that my supervisors or my managers are keeping all the frontline staff in check. And that probably makes me think that they're doing a great job because that is their job, to keep everyone doing what they need to be doing. However, I, as CEO, probably have no actual connection with the frontline staff and just how miserable they might be, or how their quote unquote proficient performance is actually the result of cutting corners or other counter control measures that help them avoid punishment from the supervisor. This is really problematic because not only in this type of scenario is it likely to lead to excessive turnover in the organization, but I, as the CEO, may never think to attribute, for example, the excessive turnover or any other issues that are coming up to the supervisory practices themselves. And so we see how easy it is then for the higher ups or other administrators to make these kind of sweeping organizational changes to address these problems, even though the changes that they're implementing actually have nothing to do with the root cause of the problems that they're trying to address. So let's watch a video right now of Dr. Aubrey Daniels, who is one of the most touted names in organizational behavior management in our field. And in this video, he talks about this phenomenon of being invested in having tough bosses. Let's now talk about supporting proficient performance. While regular supervision and feedback are the key to long-term maintenance of proficient staff performance, sometimes things are getting tough, or maybe you're new, you need a little something extra to be encouraged and motivated to bolster your staff, or bolster rapport with them, or motivate your staff. So especially incentives or recognitions are kind of a great way to build morale, make things a little fun. And to ensure that they actually function in such a way that it can improve the performance though, and it's not just all fun and games. So we really have to make sure that our interventions or sort of these extra reinforcement contingencies are functionally relevant to encourage or maintain proficient performance. So it has to be done strategically. You don't just want to throw a sticker chart up there for everyone and expect to see behavior change. Before we go further, let's hear from Dr. Aubrey Daniels once again about how to strategically employ these incentive systems so that they have functional outcomes. So, just like with your clients, if you're noticing non-compliance or general lack of enthusiasm during a session, it might be because the work is just generally unenjoyable. And work doesn't need to be needlessly aversive. Making small modifications can sometimes mean the world to your staff, and at the very least, in showing them that you care about their job satisfaction. So what are some things that make work tasks less than desirable? One of the first ones they talked about in the text was when staff feel unprepared to do their job. So when staff feel unprepared or incompetent, or like they're kind of flailing or not knowing what to do and how to be successful. This is one of the key reasons why staff turnover from agencies and experience low job satisfaction. And one of the things that they talked about in the text that really kind of feeds into this is the fact that there's not only frequent turnover within agencies, but that there's kind of a lot of temporary staffing positions in agencies, or people kind of temporarily filling in from one department to another. So when that happens, you're skipping stages of the training process to immediately fill those positions. And it's almost out of necessity, but at the same time, we're not likely to see any proficient performance on their part simply because they haven't actually been trained to do so. And I think we can all kind of relate to situations where we've been thrown into the deep end without any instructions or any training, and can understand just how aversive that can feel. Another reason that work can be unenjoyable is when performance is associated with high stakes outcomes. And so one of the examples that they gave in the book was when a staff was responsible for running some type of intervention, such as a feeding program, where the individual that they're working with has a high risk of choking or something. So that's really stressful. And think about, watching videos of people trying to defuse bombs. If you have all of these high stakes outcomes that are associated with your performance, that really requires you to be 100% focused on doing things right all the time to avoid any of those um, dangerous outcomes. And that's, again, really stressful. And we're asking a lot of staff, given how labor intensive these jobs are to begin with, and given that they don't get compensated very well, or at least equitably. So we want to make sure that if we're putting staff in a position where they're going to have to be doing these kind of very stressful, high intensity interventions, that we're also figuring out a way for there to be some balance in their jobs. So maybe they're not always with that one specific client, maybe they're rotating through so that they don't always have to be faced with that level of high demand. Another thing that can make staff's work enjoyable is when the tasks that they're assigned, unenjoyable is when the tasks that they're assigned are just kind of unnecessary, overly cumbersome, or redundant. And if a task is unnecessary and just can be gotten rid of altogether, please do so. I think one of the biggest reasons why we see so many instances of forged or fraudulent data submitted is because the data are recorded and then never done anything with. So it's not being used to make clinical decisions. I've talked to staff where they said they've seen their data sheets actually in the trash can before. And if you're not going to do anything with that data, there's no reason for you to be recording it in the first place. Obviously, recording the data poses increased risk of breach of confidentiality in the first place. So if they don't have to do it, don't make them do it, especially if it's just something that's kind of a historical rule of thumb or protocol, and the agency can really look into if any of these things are necessary. And when things are overly cumbersome, or if it's redundant, really use what you know about instructional design and behavior analysis to figure out how you can streamline those processes and really make it so that you are requiring the least effort possible from the staff while still getting the outcome or information, whatever it is that you need. Related to that, we also see that staff report low job satisfaction when they don't really understand the point of their job. They don't understand why proficient performance is important in the first place. Now, if we're talking especially about something as important to us as data collection, those that are not from a behavior analytic background may not actually know what goes on behind the scenes with the data and how important it is for us to make clinical decisions. And if you took that paper and you put it into your electronic program for graphing and you threw the paper sheets away, it's not that you didn't use them, but you didn't need the paper copies anymore. You have electronic versions now. But if the staff don't know that because you've never shared that information with them about what you do with the data, then they're going to assume that you just gave them a bunch of work that was wholly unnecessary, and they may either forge it because that's a less response effort choice, or they may just not do it, and then you're not getting the data that you need anymore. So all of these issues, with the exception of getting rid of the tasks or altering them to make them more easy, efficient, can really be addressed with training, because we can help people feel prepared and competent by actually implementing those competency-based training methods that we've talked about earlier in the term. And when we're talking about staff really understanding and buying into why their performance is important, then why they're important to kind of the big picture of treatment implementation, and making sure we include that rationale in our training programs. One of the things that the authors talked about in the text that you can do to increase job satisfaction and really show staff that you care about their morale and them enjoying their work is the Task Enjoyment Motivation Protocol, or TEMP. So the first piece of this, they said, is to really solicit staff's opinions about the specific aspects of the job that they don't like, and then not only solicit opinions about these things, but also discuss with them ideas about what can reasonably be changed, because there's nothing worse than filling out a survey or answering questions about what you think should change or be done differently if that actually doesn't lead to any change. Because we've all been in those situations and we know exactly how frustrating that is. So really honestly and sincerely discuss with them things that reasonably can be changed. And if things cannot be changed, explain why. So it's not because it's a bad idea, it's because, maybe the resources or contingencies aren't available for it. Obviously, if it's fundamentally changing the way treatments are going to be implemented, then it can't be changed. Make changes that are realistic and feasible that they suggest, make them because this will show them that you're listening to them and that you trust their opinion, and even supplement where possible with their own ideas to make the task more enjoyable. So show them that it's not all on them to figure out uh, how to fix something in the hour that you're in this with them. And really, show them that you are willing to put in the time and effort to make things better for them. Nothing goes a long way more than being sincere and being really honest or transparent about the values with which you are approaching these kind of changes or soliciting this kind of opinion or information. Because if you don't follow through, then you're just demonstrating that, kind of lip service, or, you're not really demonstrating that you're a person that can be trusted or is reliable to advocate for your staff. So also, when you are making those changes, discuss whether things improved to a reasonable degree, or they don't, or sometimes the department was left out of the loop and something's messed up and they're getting in trouble for that, even though it's not all of their fault. It's not their fault at all. So you have to make sure when these changes are being implemented that this is consistent and that you have a really thorough understanding of the organization that you're working in before you sort of take these steps. And make sure you're not overstepping your bounds with any changes that you put in place, because if you're not in the room, then those changes aren't going to be implemented. So make sure you get all of the approvals and systems level analyses that you need to understand the bigger picture. But you definitely want to make sure that you follow through on your words so that the staff see you as someone that they can go to and really talk about their concerns, because they're the ones in the trenches every day with the clients, and they're going to have the most accurate information about how things are actually going on a day-to-day basis. Just like all the different strategies that we discussed, there are going to be specific circumstances in which the temp protocol is not really going to solve your problems. And the first of which is kind of really a common problem is when the task that the staff dislikes is because of the specific program that they have drawn with the client, or they actually dislike the client themselves. And this is not uncommon. Obviously, when you're working with other people, there's a risk of not getting along with personalities or cultural differences and things like that. And you have to consider that staff are typically working with our clients in some capacity where the client is, emitting inappropriate behaviors or needs a lot of support. Maybe they have some hygiene issues and things like that. So you're really kind of putting staff in a position where not only maybe they don't like this person, but they're still responsible for them, talking to them, working with them for how many ever hours in the day. And that can really start to grate on people's nerves after a while. Similarly, if there's a specific program that they really don't like running, such as a toileting program or something like that, we can see how it's easy for us to become resentful or to start to cut corners and not run the program properly, just because the program itself is so abrasive. And again, we can't really look at this and say that the staff is not a good person or that they don't care about their job. We really need to be looking at the contingencies that are supporting that performance, whatever that performance may be. So is there enough reinforcement for proficient performance? Is there more reinforcement for the non-proficient performance and not doing the job? How are those responses being allocated? Take in all of your instructional design methodologies and philosophical understandings of behavior analysis to examine those contingencies. So one of the strategies the book talks about is to make sure as the supervisor that if you can't assign that kind of situation to someone else, that you're really going to be working with that staff to encourage them and support them and remind them of why they're there, why they're so important to that client, really bringing in that pro-social piece and the values consistency piece, even if they might not be getting any of that social reciprocity from the client themselves. So even if you can't change the client in terms of the ways in which staff are relating to them, you can perhaps change other aspects of staff's work to make it a little more enjoyable. And then as a supervisor, making sure you're keeping an eye on the fact that this dislike between staff and client is not turning into any type of maleficence, or them not running the program because they just don't want to talk to the client or be near them. Certainly any instances of where the staff are being neglectful or abusive, you are mandated to report that, and you're mandated to, it is your responsibility as a supervisor to keep an eye on that, because that kind of stuff can snowball very quickly if you don't keep an eye on it, especially in these kind of high stress jobs. Another thing that they discussed in the text was that sometimes when you're doing this temp process with staff, they're going to come at you with like 100 different things that are wrong. And those 100 different things very well may be wrong or disliked, but it doesn't mean that you can focus on all of them at once or make changes to all of them. So just like with our clients, where we're going through the process of prioritizing things that need to be targeted first or more immediately, a similar process can be used with staff. If you're in a situation where you're getting 100 different complaints about different things, really going through and prioritizing kind of the most problematic and most aversive tasks, and then going through the process for those ones specifically using the temp. Now, when you are going through the process of saying, okay, here are the top 5 things that we're going to work on, it's really important to communicate why you're prioritizing those, so that no one feels like, oh no, only certain people's voices are louder or certain suggestions are taken into consideration more than others, just so that everyone is aware that you're not playing favorites and you're actually making a very systematic decision about which tasks you're going to address first. And the last thing they talked about was if changing something is just not an option. So if changing the task itself is not an option, could you actually change how the staff are kind of assigned to address it? Though, could we do a divide and conquer and have multiple people do pieces of it, so that not just one person is constantly responsible for doing the entirety of whatever the aversive task is, and figuring out how to break that up? And how you could delegate is obviously going to be very individualized based on what the task itself is. Now, if there are instances in which your staff or supervisee's performance will not improve or adapt, regardless of you exhausting all of your efforts and feedback techniques, it may unfortunately be time to start thinking about taking disciplinary action. And I don't think anyone likes disciplining others, or at least if they do, I hope they don't have a job where they're in a position with that kind of power. But remember, we really emphasized in the last module about how important it was to document your feedback and supervisees' ongoing performance. This is where the documentation is really going to come in handy, because you will not have evidence of your training, your feedback, etc., but not only have evidence of all of that, but also evidence from your progress monitoring of your supervisee's performance and changes over time, the attempts to apply feedback and things like that. And I think it's important, like always, to make sure that your expectations are really clear from the get-go regarding what type of conditions under which those disciplinary warnings or actions will be taken, and what the corresponding consequences associated with those actions or warnings will be. What you don't want is to have an employee engage in some type of inappropriate or otherwise deficient performance multiple times without ever giving them feedback or correction, and then being like, well, that's it, that's the last straw, you're fired. Certainly if there are zero tolerance policies for specific behaviors, that should be made clear and articulated upon hiring. But do not assume that anyone has the same definition of what's appropriate or inappropriate as you would. It's really important that you actually know how to operationalize your expectations. So by having these expectations clearly communicated and documented, including their rationale, and having your attempts at providing feedback and remediating that performance documented, should the time come where you have to sanction, suspend, or fire someone, you want to make sure everything is supporting you making an objective decision. And coming to this course of action, not taking it lightly. As stated in the book, though, you can't underestimate the effect this type of disciplinary action may have on your rapport and trust with others, even outside of the specific staff member that you had to have this interaction with. Others may be doing other types of things that are likely to lead them to be more on edge around you, or likely to engage in counter control behaviors or avoidance behaviors as a result of this interaction, even if it wasn't directly related. And because of this, it's important that you really start your relationship with staff by providing as much support and being as clear of the expectations as possible, and always soliciting their input and really like setting them up for success so that nothing like this is ever coming out of the blue. Now, one thing you might already be thinking is that sometimes, there are contingencies present in the workplace that are just out of our control, meaning that we can't actually manipulate those environmental variables that are contributing to the poor performance that we're seeing. So one of the ones that they talk about in the book is when there are other authority figures or higher ups that are kind of undermining our supervisory and training practices. And depending on the type of agency that you work in or what type of setting you work in, this can manifest in a lot of different ways. So with the exception of having, your own business and you being at the top of that hierarchy, there's almost always going to be some other authority figure in place that kind of dictates policy, procedure, and how you can expect to function, in addition to what you can do to actually promote the performance of your staff. It's important to think about your role that you will be in entering these professional commitments, and how that agency structure, whatever it is, may prohibit your ability to do things to the best and in a manner that is, conceptually consistent as possible and in the way that you know how to do it. So if you're working as a consultant for a company, those are some of the most difficult positions to be in, because not only are you kind of not an employee and an integral part of the whole functioning of that company, but you don't typically have any governance over changing policy or procedure that may prohibit these change agents that you're working with, like staff and teachers, to do what you need them to do. So when you're going in as an outsider, whether you're consulting for a human service agency, whether you're consulting for a school, it's really important that you get a full understanding of how that agency operates, or that school operates, or basically how that setting operates, so that you can make sure that at the outset of the professional relationship, you're being very clear and saying, look, to do what I need to do and to do it right, and to not only work with clients, but also working with other change agents. These are all the things that I'm going to need to be able to do, and I'm going to need your support in being able to do them. So if you're going to consult with a school and you have to train a teacher in whatever it is to work with your client, then you need to make sure you let, whether it's the principal or a special ed director, whoever is your sort of person that you're reporting to, that you need their support in designing contingencies that are going to hold that teacher, that para, whoever it is, accountable for doing whatever needs to be done in best service of your client, because you're an outsider in that situation. So what you say doesn't really matter sometimes. And then when we think about if you're working in a situation where you actually are an employee of that agency and you have other authority figures that are undermining you, it's important to kind of analyze why that is. So is it a situation in which they are threatened by you? Is it a situation in which they don't really value your role in the agency? For some companies, having behavior analysts work with them is new or foreign, and they don't understand why they need us or what we're doing there. And that can be a really hard position to work in. And so when taking jobs in those agencies, it's really important for you to be able to say first, as a behavior analyst coming into work at the agency, that you solicit the full support and feedback and backing of the higher ups, so that it's not just going to be a constant uphill battle and working with staff and whoever else that it is you have to work with. If the higher ups don't want you there, I'd be very hesitant to take that job on a personal level. I also think it's interesting to think about how in our role, often working as home providers, and we're supervising and training change agents, whether those are actual technicians or therapists or the parents themselves. there again, there's potential for so many kinds of conflicting contingencies and competing contingencies with us being able to do whatever it is we need to do to train parents effectively. And so remember, we have that ethical code that says that, with our behavior change programs that we're designing, we have to make sure that we fully describe all the conditions necessary for an intervention to be successful. And then if there's anything that's going to impede or hamper those conditions, that we really fully document our every attempt to fix those situations. So if I'm working in home with a kid and I really need the parents to be implementing a program with integrity consistently and regularly, but if the parents are not cooperative for whatever reason, and if you're going into that relationship with them, it's really your responsibility, or in this case, my responsibility, to stipulate what kind of involvement I was expecting from them, and also how I was going to monitor that involvement and give them feedback on that involvement. And at what point would I say that their involvement and following my guidance or whatever was falling below the threshold of me being able to work effectively with their child anymore, at which point it would be likely to possibly terminate that relationship. So as much as you can clarify these things at the outset, that's going to save you a lot of headache in the long run. So think about it as an antecedent contingency for your work with change agents. What happens a lot is, because we don't want to ruffle any feathers or come off too assertive, especially as an early career professional, we kind of just get in there and say, well, once we have the job, we'll demonstrate our value and then we'll get the buy-in and they'll want to listen to us. And I really caution you from taking that route, because what it really results in a lot is turnover that we see at the BCBA level and people bouncing from agencies to agency, because what they find out is that things don't magically change once you're actually employed by the agency. Another thing that they talked about in the text is when there are frequently changing agency level expectations, that can be really difficult for you as a supervisor to make sure, you're effectively managing your supervisees in the context of those ever-changing expectations. And sometimes expectations change quite frequently because of organizational level changes. So maybe there's a company that got bought out or merged or something like that. With behavioral analysis training, people doing their field experience and practicum, we constantly have changes coming out of the BACB with regards to how we're supposed to document supervision, who's qualified to provide supervision, the number of hours required to be supervised in, and things like that. And so that requires you to be on top of and informed of those upcoming changes as soon as possible, so that you can be very proactive in not only communicating these changes to your staff, but also making sure that you're designing systems to support that transition process so that it isn't chaotic and overwhelming and the staff don't feel like they're receiving conflicting information. Another thing that I think is really common, not just in human services, but depending on what's going on with the economy, a lot of times we have downsizing, we have wage cuts, rates getting cut, funding sources disappearing, and a lot of this stuff is very widely publicized. So you should expect that your supervisees, your staff, your employees to catch wind of that, and it's likely going to stress them out and potentially make them nervous about whether or not they're going to get to keep their jobs or whether they lose some benefits of their jobs. And that can breed a lot of stress and rumors and things like that, and all sorts of things that can compete with their ability to perform proficiently at work because they're distracted or nervous, or because their contingencies may change because of this uncertainty. And it may also decrease their morale and commitment to stay in the agency that they think has the potential for closing down soon. So for example, if you're working at a school where a teacher you're working with learns that their contract is not going to be renewed, it's likely that their responding is going to shift when they learn that information, and they're going to be prioritizing finding another job over performing proficiently at the current one because of contingencies like making rent, buying food, housing, and things like that, which means they may be distracted from providing maximum support to the students in their classroom. And while we could say, oh, well, you don't care about the kids and you didn't fulfill your commitment as your teacher, to them. We have to be pragmatic and human and recognize that their contingencies have changed drastically, and that was more immediately pressing to them than making sure that they were delivering effective instruction to the students in their classroom, which is more important to parents of those students and can be a source of conflict. So whether or not you actually have any control in these changing contingencies or expectations of the agency, really the best thing that you can do is maintain open communication with staff and be as transparent as possible or is appropriate. It's particularly hard when you might be in a position where you are getting more information about what's going on, like layoffs or changes in salary, than your staff are. And you might be in a position where that information is disclosed to you, but you aren't allowed to disclose it to your staff. And if that's the case, it's important to clarify with your authority figure, supervisor, boss, what explicitly you're allowed to communicate, because the rumor mill is going to get started pretty immediately. And you want to make sure that you're not only being as supportive to your staff as possible, while not essentially like outright lying to them or deceiving them, because that's really going to damage rapport. If some of these people have to leave the company and others stay, and those that stay realize that you withheld information, regardless of what your contingencies or what the situation may be. And when you're communicating with your staff about any changes that may be coming up, it's important you're providing rationale and context in these communications. So hopefully any changes are the results of things that are out of your control. So say if the agency is losing a funding source or something like that, and we lost this funding source, we can't do anything about it. We're trying to secure others, but in the meantime, we're trying to make sure that, first and foremost, the clients are taken care of and there's no disruption in their services. And then your second priority has to be the staff being treated really well, because just kind of having mass layoffs or cuts or loss of benefits and things like that is going to really be disruptive, not only to the staff's well-being, but their job satisfaction, work productivity, which then negatively affects the clients who are your first priority. So then it all comes back to how this is going to hurt your client. And while that is true, it doesn't hurt for you to consider that your staff are humans and their well-being should be something that you value, not just because it's in service to the client, but also because it's in service to them as people that you work with. So as much as possible, providing rationale and context in your communication is helpful, and really empathizing with your staff that, hey, this is stressful, not knowing what's going on and things like that. And all of that is only possible if you've sort of in an ongoing manner develop rapport and establish trust as, a supervisor. So let's watch a quick video once again by Dr. Aubrey Daniels about how the supervisors best can communicate during these difficult, uncertain times. So in general, one of the best things that you can do when trying to communicate with your staff in such a way to really ameliorate any type of stress or uncertainty that they're experiencing is to make sure that you're staying as focused as possible. So what are you specifically responsible for, and what can you specifically control as a supervisor? And then with the staff, what are they specifically responsible for, and what can they specifically control? And this really allows you to maintain, perspective, and also be, maintain supportive, encouraging supervisory practices, and focus on how they can still play a meaningful role, make a meaningful contribution to the agency or the workplace and the clients that they're providing a service to. You also want to, in your communication with staff, whether it's a difficult time of uncertainty at the agency or just them personally experiencing stress, really focus on how they are making substantial, meaningful change to the clients that you serve. Because we're always going to be ultimately serving individuals that need our services. and really reiterating that rationale, that underlying value of why we're all here, why we're all on the same page, and what our common goal is, can help kind of bolster your rapport and trust with them and make it so that it's not so much of, well, this is my job, that's your job, and we're all here to, but more like we're all here to work on the same thing together, and really highlighting those values, which I think is such a key aspect of human services. It's also important to remember that you are a behaving organism and therefore not immune to the same issues that your staff may be experiencing. So are you motivated as a supervisor? How are you reflecting on your own behavior? How are you ensuring that your behavior is not being affected, at least overtly, by the same things that are affecting staff's behavior? Because if you're stressed and you're withdrawn and you're overwhelmed at work, then that's just kind of going to bleed into your interactions with staff and keeping from feeling out of control and hopeless is hard, especially when you're working in situations where you're having difficulty really being effective at your job. So it's important that we, whatever strategies we're communicating with our staff to help them through these processes and help them feel valued and motivated, we need to be thinking about those same strategies for ourselves. So one of the things they talked about in the text was making sure that we're kind of setting clear goals for ourselves. We need to be evaluating our progress towards meeting those goals and really reinforcing those accomplishments. So not just focusing on our goals as it relates to specific client outcomes, but what are your goals as a supervisor in terms of not just improving staff performance, but creating an enjoyable, ethical workplace? How are you going to create those goals for yourself? And again, evaluate whether or not you're meeting those goals, because that can give you some feedback that you need to get over the hump in those difficult times where you may feel that things are kind of spiraling out of control at work. And when it comes to reinforcing your accomplishments, thinking about who can you help and who can help you hold you accountable in this process and reinforce those accomplishments. And you shouldn't be putting it on your staff to motivate you, because there's a power differential there that you would be abusing. And that's just unethical and it's not good supervisory practice. Even though it's always nice to hear from the people that you're supervising that you're doing a good job, it is not their responsibility to make you feel better. And it's important that you don't expect your higher ups to recognize your accomplishments and reinforce them appropriately, because their goals and how they're measuring productivity or effectiveness may be very different from how you were kind of incrementally setting up goals, shaping them, and we might not be able to get that kind of permanent outcome right away. So think of self-monitoring, which can really be bolstered by sharing your successes with your peers and colleagues, especially if you have mentors outside of your specific workplace, so that it can be really you focused on your accomplishments and not putting that in the context of, oh, you're doing a great job, especially since all of these terrible things are happening at work. You don't want to have your accomplishments qualified like that. They're meaningful in their own right. So it's important to always have some kind of trusted colleagues outside of work, peers, collaborators, mentors that you can be sharing these successes with. And even with friends and family, focusing on highlighting what's going well and allowing them space to reinforcing, congratulating you on that. Whereas oftentimes I feel like when we're talking about our work lives with our loved ones, it's a lot of venting. And that's going to be quite negative for them as well if they hear about constantly how horrible things are at work for you. So it's important that not in a sense of toxic positivity or focusing on the positives, but really just using the tools that we have as scientists and behavior analysts. We want to make sure that we're contextualizing accomplishments or failures, but we are also acknowledging that accomplishments are meaningful and worthwhile in their own right, because they're helping to improve all of these things that are not going so great at work.